In every era, great powers test each other at the edges of the world. Today, those edges are no longer oceans or mountain ranges. They are orbital shells filled with satellites, sensors, and systems that never sleep. If you want to know whether America's Space Force can withstand China and Russia in that environment, then stay with me. The answer is stranger and funnier than most headlines admit. Hello, my name is Gene Botkin. I am a cybersecurity analyst working in the space domain, and I'm building a club for people who want to participate in the new space economy. Our topic today is whether America's Space Force can defeat China and Russia in a real conflict. Let's begin. If you really want to understand the balance of power in orbit, then you have to start with a simple truth. Nations behave in space the same way they behave on Earth, only with better lighting. The ambitions do not change. The personalities do not change. The dysfunction doesn't change. They just float now. And when you compare the United States, China, and Russia in that environment, the contrast becomes almost cinematic. The United States enters the scene the way an older cousin shows up at a family reunion, slightly tired, slightly overextended, and surrounded by responsibilities that it didn't exactly ask for. Meanwhile, China walks in with a clipboard and a 5 year plan, and Russia arrives late, carrying something that looks dangerous, but which may or may not function. That's your cast. And they orbit the same planet, but they behave like they live on three different ones. The Space Force ends up playing the role of a harassed accountant trying to keep the books balanced, while the other two throw furniture. It inherited a space architecture full of satellites before TikTok existed. It inherited an acquisition process that ages like milk. And it inherited the job of maintaining America's orbital dominance at a time when the other two countries are experimenting with increasingly creative ways of causing trouble. China prefers elegance. Their satellites glide through the orbit in the way that a suspiciously quiet cat prowls a living room, and one moment they're in a stable orbit. The next, they drift a little too close to an American asset, and they never collide, they never touch, they just hint at the possibility. Anyone who has lived in an apartment complex knows this tactic. It's the cosmic version of a neighbor who parks half an inch from your bumper. They're not technically doing anything wrong, but they're definitely telling you something. Russia, meanwhile, is less subtle. Their approach to space resembles their approach to plumbing. Make sure that it works most of the time, and if something breaks, shrug. When Russia tests anti satellite missiles, they produce debris clouds that socialize the consequences across multiple nations. It is the closest thing to space communism that they've ever successfully implemented. When they jam GPS, they don't bother hiding it. It is almost polite, but at least you know who to blame. Now, the US response to these behaviors is complicated by the size of its own orbital footprint. Much like a person with too many browser tabs open, America struggles to keep track of everything it has up there: navigation satellites, weather systems, missile warning platforms. Space Force officers watch over them the way an exhausted parent watches over their toddler at the playground. Every object is valuable, every object is fragile, and every object can cause headaches if it wanders where it shouldn't. The biggest advantage the United States has isn't its number of satellites, but its depth of supporting infrastructure. China has factories, Russia has legacy designs. America has an entire economy built around the idea that anything worth doing should also be done by at least four private companies: SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Amazon Kuiper, and a revolving cast of startups provide a kind of orbital redundancy that no other country can replicate. If the US military loses a satellite, someone in the private sector will happily build a replacement, preferably on a subscription model. China understands this vulnerability and focuses on targeting the connective tissue. Their military thinkers study how the US relies on satellites for command, control, communication, and intelligence. They know the United States cannot fight the way it's used to fighting without them. So they invest in co-orbital systems, laser dazzlers, radio frequency warfare, and cyber intrusions. China's strategy is simple: don't fight America's strengths, fight America's dependencies. Russia takes a different route. Their strategy could be described as annoy until something breaks. Their electronic warfare systems are some of the best in the world because chaos is cheap. Russia can deny a region's GPS coverage without leaving fingerprints. They can interfere with satellite communications without ever launching their own replacements. A Russian general once described this approach as making life inconvenient for the enemy. It's the kind of motto that you would expect on a novelty mug, but it works. So, can the Space Force beat them? Before answering that, it helps to consider what beat means in orbit. There is no front line and there are no hills to capture. There is no territory in the traditional sense. Winning in space means maintaining awareness, protecting capabilities, and preventing your adversaries from using theirs. It's closer to network security than to battlefield maneuvers. If you've ever defended a server from an attacker, then you understand more about space warfare than most Cold War generals ever did. The Space Force excels at awareness. It operates the world's most advanced space surveillance networks. Its sensors track everything from active satellites to flakes of paint traveling at speeds normally reserved for bad decisions. The US can see almost everything that happens in orbit. Seeing, however, is not enough. You also need to respond. And that is where the challenge begins. America's legacy satellites were built for longevity, not agility. Many were launched before maneuverability became a serious requirement. They cannot dodge anything. They weren't designed to compete with adversaries who treat orbit like a chessboard. And in a world where satellites stalk each other at close range, agility becomes a survival trait. China builds satellites with that in mind. Russia, on the other hand, improvises with something just as effective. The good news for the Space Force is that the private sector is developing new generations of satellites that can maneuver, reposition, and even coordinate as constellations. The bad news is that fielding them inside the Department of Defense is like trying to push a shopping cart with square wheels. It will move, but only after everyone complains about the budget. Hardware isn't the only challenge. The cyber domain is the real jungle. Every satellite has a ground station, and every ground station has software. Each piece of software can be attacked. The difference between a functioning constellation and a billion-dollar light show is often a firewall. China invests heavily in cyber units capable of infiltrating TT&C links and ground networks. Russia invests in everything that can jam, spoof, or scramble a signal. Cyber operations are cheaper than rockets. They do not require spaceports. They don't require launch windows. Instead, they require a keyboard and a lack of ethics. The United States has strong cyber capabilities, but coordination between agencies is not always elegant. Space Force handles the space part. Cyber Command handles the cyber part. The two often coordinate the way divorced parents coordinate a vacation schedule. They both want the kid to be safe, but they just disagree about which car seat to use. Yet the biggest wildcard in all of this is China's long-term planning. They operate on a timeline that makes Western governments look like they're speed-running their own budgets. China is building a sensor-rich, AI-driven, redundantly launched, and heavily subsidized space ecosystem designed to saturate orbit with their own platforms. Their strategy is less about confrontation and more about accumulation. If they launch faster, build cheaper, and monitor more, then they will win by volume. Russia can never match that. Their space program is still suffering from post-Soviet entropy, but they have sharp engineers and a military culture that embraces improvisation. A country doesn't need 1,000 satellites to cause trouble. It needs a dozen well-placed ones and a doctrine that treats disruption as an art. So, where does this leave the Space Force? It leaves them in a position of strength, but not comfort. They have the best tools, the best partners, and the best launch capabilities. They also have bureaucracy, aging infrastructure, and a budget process that seems designed to test the limits of human sanity. If a conflict erupted today, the United States would probably maintain space superiority. Its ability to detect threats, reposition assets, and replace losses is unparalleled. China would test boundaries, Russia would throw wrenches, but the US would adapt faster. In 10 years, the situation is less certain. China's industrial capacity is growing. Their launch cadence is accelerating. Their integration of AI and space surveillance networks is becoming impressive in a way that keeps analysts awake at night. The United States still leads, but the margin is thinning. However, the most important factor is neither hardware nor software. It is institutional agility. The country that adapts fastest wins. The Space Force is young enough to change. China is determined enough to change. Russia is unpredictable enough to make change irrelevant. America still holds the high ground. Whether it keeps it depends on whether its institutions can move as fast as its rockets. If you found this breakdown useful, then hit the like button so the algorithm knows that this content matters. Leave a comment with your thoughts or questions about the future of space conflict, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the space economy and the strategies shaping it. This has been Gene Botkin with Eleonora. End transmission.